The espresso machine hissed, but the dining room was dead silent. When the city's most dangerous men walk into your restaurant, you keep your head down. You pour the water. You survive. But when a terrified waiter botched an order for the boss's deaf mother, hands drifted toward hidden holsters. That's when the quiet girl in the stained apron did the unthinkable. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She raised her hands and she started to speak. The kitchen of Trattoria di Notte smelled of roasted garlic, scorched butter, and quiet desperation. It was a Tuesday night. The rain outside was relentless, hammering against the frosted glass of the front windows and turning the Chicago streets into a smeared oil painting. Inside, the heat was suffocating. Corliss dragged the back of her wrist across her forehead, leaving a faint streak of flour near her hairline. Her feet ached. They always ached. At 24, she had the lower back of a retired roofer and the bank account of a high school sophomore. She leaned against the stainless steel prep counter, watching the swinging double doors that led out to the dining room. Beyond those doors lay a different world, a world of crisp, white linen $200 bottles of Barolo, and men who paid in cash from rolls thick enough to choke a horse. Table 4 needs the branzino. Chef Rossi barked, slamming a silver platter down on the heat lamps. And tell Paul to keep his sweating face away from the pass. He's dripping anxiety on my garnish. Corliss grabbed the heavy plates, balancing them effortlessly on her forearms. He's sweating because the back room just filled up. Rossi paused, his tongs hovering over a bed of risotto. His dark eyes flicked toward the double doors. Who? The Harris family. The name didn't carry a grand cinematic weight in the kitchen. It carried a cold, practical reality. It meant no mistakes. It meant the busboys walked a little softer, the bartenders poured a little heavier, and the waiters suddenly found reasons to organize the silverware drawer instead of taking the floor. Drayden Harris had inherited the family business 6 months ago after his father caught a bullet outside a bakery in Cicero. Drayden wasn't the old guard. He didn't wear fedoras or kiss cheeks. He was 32, built like a welterweight boxer, and ran his organization with the ruthless, sterile efficiency of a corporate raider. He was a man drowning in a war he hadn't started, and the pressure radiated off him like heat off asphalt. Corliss pushed through the doors and navigated the crowded floor. She kept her eyes neutral, her expression carefully blank. It was a survival mechanism she'd honed over 3 years in the service industry. People didn't want to see the help. They wanted the food to magically appear. As she delivered the branzino to a pair of oblivious tourists, she let her gaze drift toward the alcove at the back of the room. It was slightly elevated, partially obscured by a velvet rope and a heavy oak partition. 3 men sat at the table, flanked by 2 others standing by the velvet rope. Drayden Harris sat at the head. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Corliss's rent for the year his tie pulled loose, his dark hair messy from fingers being run through it too many times. He was flanked by his lieutenants, broad-shouldered men with thick necks and flat, dead eyes. They were leaning in, talking in low, urgent bursts. But it wasn't the men that caught Corliss's attention. It was the woman sitting to Drayden's right. She was in her late 50s, wearing an elegant emerald green blouse, her silver hair pinned up in a flawless twist. Corinne Harris, Drayden's mother. She sat perfectly straight, her hands folded delicately in her lap. And she was utterly, entirely alone. The men around her were arguing. Corliss could see the sharp, aggressive movements of their hands, the tightening of their jaws. Corinne's eyes darted from face to face, trying to catch the shape of their lips. She was deaf. Corliss had heard the whispers from the older staff, the rumors that the boss's mother lived in a world of absolute silence. Corinne leaned forward slightly, trying to track a rapid-fire exchange between Drayden and the man across from him. But the men talked over each other, looking down at the table, covering their mouths with their hands as they plotted. Corinne's brow furrowed. She tapped Drayden's arm gently. Drayden didn't look at her. He just patted her hand, a dismissive automatic gesture, and kept talking to his lieutenant. Corinne shrank back into her chair. Her eyes a striking, clear blue dulled. She picked up her water glass, taking a slow sip, staring at the white tablecloth. She was a ghost at her own family's dinner. Corliss felt a sudden, sharp twist in her chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was cheap. It was a fierce, familiar frustration. She recognized that look. It was the same look her younger brother Sam used to get at the dinner table when their parents argued over the bills, speaking too fast for him to read their lips, leaving him stranded in the crossfire. Sam had been gone for 4 years now, but the ghost of his isolation lived in Corinne Harris's stooped shoulders. "Hey!" A sharp poke in the ribs broke Corliss's trance. It was Paul, the floor manager. His face was shiny with grease and panic. "Stop staring at the back table. Do you want to get us all shot? I'm just looking." Corliss muttered, turning away. "Don't look. Don't breathe near them. Just let Kevin handle it." Corliss frowned. "You put Kevin on the Harris table." "He started 3 days ago. He dropped a tray of water glasses this morning because a bus horn scared him. Nobody else would take it." Paul hissed, wiping his forehead with a napkin. "I told him to just take the order nod and get out. It'll be fine." Corliss looked back at the alcove. Kevin, a lanky 19-year-old with a terrible haircut and hands that were already visibly shaking, was approaching the velvet rope. He looked like a lamb walking into a slaughterhouse. "Sure," Corliss said, her voice dry. "Fine." The tension in the alcove was a physical thing. You could have hung a wet towel on it. Drayden rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, ragged breath. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. The shipments at the docks were stalled, the unions were bleeding him dry, and the feds were sniffing around his legitimate fronts. Taking his mother out for her birthday dinner was supposed to be an hour of normalcy. Instead, it had turned into an emergency briefing over antipasto. "Tell them they get 20% or we burn the warehouse," Drayden said quietly, his voice a low rasp. "They won't take 20, Dom." His lieutenant, a scarred man named Arthur, replied. "They want a third. They get 20. Drayden repeated, his eyes flashing up cold and flat. "Or I start sending pieces of their crew back in priority mail." Kevin arrived at the table. He stood there for a full 10 seconds, clutching a leather-bound notepad to his chest, like a ballistic shield waiting to be acknowledged. No one looked at him. Corinne noticed him first. She offered the terrified kid a warm, polite smile. She pointed to her menu, then tapped the picture of the veal scallopini. Kevin blinked, swallowing hard. Excuse me, gentlemen, ma'am." The conversation snapped shut. 3 pairs of eyes heavy with violent intent turned to look at the teenager. "What?" Drayden snapped. I need to take your orders." Kevin squeaked. Drayden sighed, running a hand over his face. "Give me the ribeye. Rare. Arthur same. Get the capris for the middle." He waved a hand dismissively. "Just bring food." Kevin wrote frantically, his pen tearing the paper. He looked at Corinne. "And for the lady—" Corinne looked at Kevin, then pointed to the veal again on the menu. She tried to articulate the words, her voice soft and carrying the distinct cadence of the profoundly deaf. "Veal, please." Kevin froze. He hadn't understood her. He looked at her fingers on the menu, but the print was small and upside down from his angle. Panic seized him. He looked at Drayden for help, but Drayden had already turned back to Arthur, leaning over the table, whispering furiously about the dock schedules. He wasn't paying attention to the waiter. He wasn't paying attention to his mother. I'm sorry, Mom," Kevin stammered, leaning in. Corinne's smile tightened. It was the forced, polite smile of someone who spends their entire life apologizing for an inconvenience they didn't ask for. She tapped the menu harder. She pointed to her own chest, then to the veal. Kevin's hands were shaking so badly he dropped his pen. He ducked under the table to grab it, knocking his shoulder against Arthur's knee. Arthur shifted his hand instinctively, dropping toward the inside of his jacket. "Watch it, kid," Arthur growled. Kevin popped back up, pale as a sheet. I'm sorry. Mom, do you want the chicken?" He pointed to a random spot on the menu, speaking overly loud, enunciating like she was stupid. "Chicken." Corinne shrank back. A flush of embarrassment crept up her neck. She looked at Drayden, touching his sleeve. Drayden jerked his arm away, entirely absorbed in his argument with Arthur. "Not now, Ma. Just order." Corinne dropped her hands to her lap. She looked down at the white tablecloth. She gave a small, defeated nod to Kevin. Kevin, sweating profusely, scribbled chicken on his pad and bolted from the table like he was on fire. From her station by the espresso machine, Corliss watched the entire exchange. Her blood boiled. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. She watched Corinne staring at her empty water glass, entirely shut out of the world. She watched Drayden, a man who commanded hundreds of dangerous men, fail completely to command 2 minutes of patience for the woman who raised him. 20 minutes later, the food arrived. Kevin approached the table, balancing a massive tray on his shoulder. He was moving too fast, his eyes darting nervously. He distributed the steaks to the men, the heavy plates clattering against the wood. Finally, he placed a plate in front of Corinne. It was the chicken masala, smothered in mushrooms. Corinne looked at it. She pushed the plate away slightly, a look of mild distress on her face. She tapped Drayden's arm again, more urgently this time. Drayden stopped mid-sentence. He looked at the plate, then up at Kevin. "What is this?" "The chicken, sir." Kevin stammered. "Like she ordered." "She didn't order the chicken," Drayden said, his voice dropping an octave. The ambient noise in the restaurant seemed to dim in response. "She's allergic to mushrooms." Kevin took a step back. She nodded. I asked her if she wanted the chicken, and she nodded. "My mother is deaf, you idiot." Drayden stood up slowly. He wasn't tall, but he seemed to fill the room, sucking the oxygen out of the space. "She nodded because you were shouting at her like she was a half-wit and she was embarrassed. Are you trying to kill her?" "No, I swear." Kevin backed up his heel, catching on the thick leg of a serving cart. He stumbled. His arms flailed. The heavy tray in his hand swung wildly, catching the edge of the table. A crystal wine glass tipped over. The red wine spilled like fresh blood across the pristine white linen right into Drayden's lap. The glass rolled off the table and hit the hardwood floor, shattering with a sharp, violent crack that sounded exactly like a gunshot. Chaos erupted. Arthur and the other lieutenant were on their feet in a fraction of a second, coats thrown, open hands gripping the butts of heavy pistols tucked into their waistbands. The 2 bodyguards by the velvet rope surged forward, grabbing Kevin by the collar and slamming him back against the oak partition. The teenager let out a strangled, breathless cry, his feet dangling off the floor. The rest of the restaurant went dead still. Diners froze with forks halfway to their mouths. Paul, the manager, ducked behind the host stand. Drayden stood over the table, staring at the ruined suit, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked at the shattered glass, then slowly raised his eyes to Kevin, who was whimpering against the wood paneling. "Take him out back," Drayden whispered. The order was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. Corinne stood up, her face pale with terror. She grabbed Drayden's arm, pulling at him, pleading with her eyes. She didn't know exactly what had been said, but she understood the violence in the room. She was signing rapidly, furiously, but Drayden wouldn't look at her hands. He kept his eyes locked on the waiter. Corliss didn't think. If she thought about it, she would have stayed behind the counter. She would have let the mobsters do what they were going to do. Instead, she untied her stained apron, threw it over the espresso machine, and walked out onto the floor. Her footsteps were completely silent on the hardwood. She didn't run. Running signaled panic. Running made you pray. She walked with the steady, measured pace of someone walking into the ocean. "Hey," Paul hissed from behind the host stand, his hand reaching out to grab her ankle. "Are you crazy? Get back here." Corliss stepped over his hand. She bypassed the two bodyguards holding Kevin. She didn't look at the guns. She didn't look at the lieutenant staring daggers at her. She walked straight to the table, stopping directly in front of Drayden Harris. He turned his dead black eyes on her. The vein in his neck was pulsing. "Get out of my face." "Let the boy go," Corliss said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. It lacked the tremor that usually infected anyone speaking to the boss of the Harris family. Drayden laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound. "Excuse me, he's 19. He's an idiot, and he's terrified of you." Corliss said, her eyes locked on Drayden's. "You're ruining your mother's dinner over a kid who makes minimum wage." Arthur took a step forward, his hand slipping fully under his jacket. "Dom, want me to clear her out?" "I'll clear myself out," Corliss said, turning her back on Arthur. A deeply dangerous move, but she knew instinctive predators. If you show fear, they bite. She turned away from the mob boss and looked at Corinne. The older woman was trembling, clutching her napkin. Her beautiful blue eyes were wide with distress, watching the angry faces of the men unable to intervene, locked behind a wall of silence. Corliss took a breath. She softened her posture. She let the cynicism, the exhaustion, the anger of the kitchen melt away. She brought her hands up to her chest. She caught Corinne's eye. Hello, Corliss signed her movements, crisp, fluid, and deeply respectful. "I am so sorry about the mess." "And the noise." Corinne froze. The breath hitched in her throat. She stared at Corliss's hands, then up at Corliss's face, searching to see if this was a trick or mockery. Corliss offered a small, genuine smile. "Your son is very angry, but nobody is going to get hurt, I promise." A profound, heavy shockwave rolled through the room. It wasn't the sound of a gun or the breaking of glass. It was the absolute stillness of the Mafia boss. Drayden stood frozen, his hands planted on the ruined tablecloth, staring at the waitress. Arthur's jaw went slack. He looked from Corliss to Drayden, completely bewildered. Corinne's hands came up, shaking slightly. No sign she signed back, her expression a mix of disbelief and overwhelming relief. "My brother Corliss signed, tapping her forehead and bringing her hand down. He taught me." She looked at the chicken on the table. "You wanted the veal, didn't you, with the lemon butter?" Corinne nodded frantically. A tear spilled over her lashes, tracing a line down her powdered cheek. It was the tears of someone who had been shouting into a void for years, and suddenly miraculously heard an echo. "Yes. Please. They talk too fast. I can never catch it." "I know," Corliss signed, her face softening with profound empathy. "Men talk a lot, but they rarely say anything important." A sudden sharp bark of laughter echoed in the alcove. Corliss glanced over. Corinne had laughed aloud. It was a beautiful, raw sound. Drayden was staring at his mother. The rage had drained from his face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. He hadn't heard his mother laugh like that in over a decade. He looked at Corliss. Really looked at her for the first time. He saw the cheap, orthotic shoes, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she stood tall despite the obvious exhaustion weighing her down. Corliss turned back to Corinne. "I will bring you the veal. Fresh, 5 minutes." She reached down and calmly picked up the plate of chicken masala. She turned to the bodyguards who were still holding a weeping Kevin against the wall. "Put him down," Corliss said. She didn't sign it. She spoke it aloud, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a head waitress in her own dining room. The bodyguards didn't move. They looked to Drayden. Drayden stood in silence for a long moment. He looked at the shattered glass on the floor. He looked at his mother, who was sitting up straighter now, wiping her eyes with her napkin, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. She looked present. For the first time all night, she looked like she belonged at the table. Drayden gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. The bodyguards let go. Kevin slid down the wall, collapsing into a heap, gasping for air. "Go to the back, Kevin," Corliss ordered quietly. "Tell Paul to clock you out." Kevin didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet and practically sprinted for the kitchen doors. Corliss balanced the plate on her forearm. She bent down, grabbed a handful of napkins, and efficiently swept the broken glass into a pile, wrapping it securely before dropping it onto her tray. She stood back up, adjusting her grip. She looked at Drayden. He was still watching her, his dark eyes intense, calculating. The violent mobster was gone, replaced by a man trying to solve a puzzle he didn't realize he was looking at. "Your veal will be right out, Mr. Harris," Corliss said calmly. "Can I get you another glass of wine for the spill?" Drayden stared at her hands, then at her face. "Who are you?" "I'm your waitress," Corliss said flatly. She didn't offer a name. She didn't offer a smile. She turned on her heel, pushed past the bewildered lieutenants, and walked back towards the kitchen doors. She didn't look back, but she could feel the weight of Drayden Harris's stare burning into her spine every step of the way. As the kitchen doors swung shut behind her, the dining room remained deadly quiet. Corinne tugged on Drayden's sleeve. He looked down. His mother was smiling, signing a single emphatic word. "Keeper." The kitchen doors hadn't even stopped swinging before Chef Rossi grabbed Corliss by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her collarbone. "Are you out of your mind?" He hissed, his face inches from hers. He smelled of stale tobacco and sheer panic. "You don't talk to them. You don't look at them. You certainly don't tell their gorillas to drop a waiter." Corliss shoved his hands off. She walked to the prep station, grabbed a clean linen towel, and wiped the sweat from her neck. Kevin was going to get shot over a plate of chicken Rossi. Plate the veal, heavy on the lemon butter. Rossi stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. He looked toward the double doors, then back at her, shaking his head. He didn't argue. He turned to the line, barking at the sous chef to fire the veal. 5 minutes later, Corliss pushed back through the doors. The dining room was still draped in an uneasy silence. Diners were eating, but they were doing it carefully, minimizing the clatter of silverware against porcelain. She approached the alcove. The shattered glass was gone, swept up by a terrified busboy while she was in the back. Drayden was sitting with his forearms resting on the table, staring at the empty space where the mess had been. Arthur and the other lieutenant were tense, their eyes tracking Corliss's every movement. Corliss set the plate in front of Corinne. The veal was perfectly seared, the sauce glossy and fragrant. "Careful. The plate is hot," Corliss signed quickly, keeping her movements subtle so as not to draw more attention than she already had. Corinne smiled, a real crinkling smile that reached her eyes. She picked up a fork and took a bite, closing her eyes in appreciation. She pointed at the food, gave a thumbs up, and signed, "Thank you." Corliss gave a short nod. She didn't look at Drayden. She didn't ask if they needed anything else. She turned and walked away. For the rest of the evening, she avoided the back alcove. She let Paul refill their water, ignoring his frantic, whispered complaints. When it was finally time for the Harris party to leave, Corliss was in the back rolling silverware in the cramped break room. She only emerged when she heard the heavy front doors click shut. The table was empty. The crumpled napkins were tossed haphazardly over the plates. Underneath Corinne's empty water glass, folded perfectly in half, was a stack of bills. Paul materialized out of nowhere, his hand reaching out. "I'll take that. House tip considering the damages." Corliss moved faster. She snatched the stack, her fingers brushing the cold condensation of the glass. She flipped the fold open. It was 10 crisp $100 bills. $1,000. It was more than she made in 2 weeks of double shifts. "Put it back, Corliss," Paul warned, his voice dropping. Kevin broke the glass. Corliss said, stuffing the cash into her apron pocket. "Take it out of his check. This is mine." She didn't sleep that night. The adrenaline took hours to burn off, leaving her hollow and wired in her cramped 4th-floor walk-up. She lay on her mattress, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, replaying the look in Drayden Harris's eyes. It wasn't the look of a man who was grateful. It was the look of a man who had found something he didn't know he was looking for. And that terrified her. The next afternoon, the sky over Chicago was a bruised, heavy purple. Corliss arrived at the restaurant 3 hours before the dinner rush. The alleyway behind Trattoria di Notte smelled of damp cardboard and rotting onions. She pulled her coat tighter around her neck, digging her keys out of her bag. A shadow detached itself from the brick wall near the dumpster. Corliss froze. Her hand tightened around the jagged metal of her keys, sliding them between her knuckles. It was Arthur, the scarred lieutenant from the night before. In the harsh daylight, the deep groove running down his left cheek looked pale and jagged. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a heavy leather jacket and dark jeans, but the bulk of a shoulder holster was clearly visible under the leather. He didn't move toward her. He just leaned against the brick, lighting a cigarette. "Relax." Arthur grunted, exhaling a plume of grey smoke. "If I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't be standing out here in the open freezing my arse off." Corliss didn't lower her hand. "The employee entrance is private property." Arthur laughed. It was a harsh scraping sound. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, embossed business card. He flicked it perfectly through the air. It landed on the wet asphalt at Corliss's feet. "The boss wants a word," Arthur said. Corliss looked down at the card. It was blank, except for an address in the Gold Coast and a time. 3 p.m. tomorrow. "I have a double shift tomorrow," Corliss said, keeping her eyes on Arthur. "Your shifts are covered for the rest of the week. I don't work for you. Or him." Arthur took a slow drag of his cigarette. "Nobody said you did. He just wants to talk about his mother." Corliss stared at him. She thought about the $1,000 sitting in a coffee can on her kitchen counter. She thought about Corinne Harris shrinking into her chair, a prisoner in her own family. "I'm not going to his house," Corliss said flatly. "If he wants to talk, he can come here, tomorrow at 10 in the morning. The restaurant is closed. The front doors will be unlocked." Arthur raised an eyebrow. He looked genuinely amused. "You're dictating terms to Drayden Harris." "I'm telling you my availability," Corliss said, stepping around the card on the ground and shoving her key into the heavy metal door. "Take it or leave it." She stepped inside and slammed the door shut, throwing the deadbolt with a loud metallic crack. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. At 10 o'clock the next morning, the restaurant was a cavern of shadows and the sharp smell of industrial bleach. The chairs were stacked upside down on the tables. The espresso machine was silent. Corliss sat in a booth near the front windows, nursing a lukewarm cup of black drip coffee. She wore a faded grey sweater and jeans stripped of her apron and the false deference of her uniform. Exactly at 10, the heavy oak front door clicked open. Drayden walked in. He was alone. No Arthur. No bodyguards checking the corners. He wore a dark, navy overcoat over a simple black turtleneck. In the muted morning light, he looked exhausted. The shadows under his eyes were deep, and the sharp angles of his jaw seemed cut from stone. He locked the door behind him and walked over to her booth. He didn't ask for permission to sit. He slid into the vinyl bench across from her, moving with the heavy, deliberate grace of a large predator. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The ambient noise of the city traffic drifted through the thick glass. You told Arthur to bring me to you, Drayden said finally. His voice was low, devoid of the jagged edge it had carried 2 nights ago. I don't go to second locations with men who shoot people for a living, Corliss replied. She took a sip of her coffee, her hands perfectly steady. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of Drayden's mouth, but it vanished instantly. He leaned back, unbuttoning his overcoat. My mother hasn't stopped talking about you, he said. I imagine she hasn't stopped signing about me. Corliss corrected her voice, entirely devoid of warmth. Since she can't talk? Drayden's jaw tightened. He looked away, staring at the stacked chairs on the nearest table. I know. Do you? Corliss leaned forward. She didn't know where the anger was coming from, but it was hot and immediate. You brought her to a loud public restaurant, seated her in the middle of a business dispute, and ignored her for 45 minutes. She thought she was ordering veal. You almost let a terrified kid feed her something that would put her in the hospital. You don't know anything. If anyone else in Chicago had spoken to Drayden Harris that way, they would have been bleeding on the floor. Drayden just took it. He let the words hit him, and he didn't flinch. She went deaf 5 years ago. Drayden said quietly. Meningitis, it was fast. 1 month she was fine, the next. Nothing. My father didn't want to deal with it. He hired nurses. He bought her expensive hearing aids that didn't work. When he died, I took over. He dragged a hand over his face. I took over everything. The business, the family, the enemies. I don't have time to learn a new language. I don't have time to hold her hand. So you just let her disappear. I keep her safe. Drayden snapped his eyes, flashing back to hers, hard and defensive. She has the best security in the city. She lives in a fortress. A quiet fortress. Corliss said softly. That's just a tomb. The fight drained out of him. He looked down at the table. For a fraction of a second, the mob boss vanished, and Corliss saw the 32-year-old man, crumbling under the weight of an empire he never asked to build. She laughed. Drayden said, When you talk to her. I haven't heard her laugh in 3 years. He reached into his coat pocket. Corliss's breath caught her muscles tensing, but he didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and slid it across the table. Corliss looked at it, but didn't touch it. What is that? A contract, Drayden said. I want to hire you. I'm a waitress. You're a translator. You're a companion. Drayden tapped the paper. 3 days a week. You come to the estate. You have lunch with her. You go with her to the gardens to her appointments. You translate for me when I need to speak with her. Corliss stared at him like he had lost his mind. You want me to work for the Mafia? I want you to talk to my mother, Drayden said flatly. You're not moving weight. You're not sitting in on sit-downs. You're strictly civilian. My men will know you are untouchable. You come in, you keep her company, you go home. No. Corliss shook her head, sliding the paper back across the table. I need this job. I need the tip money. I don't need the feds taking photos of me walking into a syndicate stronghold. Find an agency. Hire a professional. I did. Drayden counted. 3 of them. They were terrified of the guards. They treated my mother like a patient. She hated them. He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. She specifically asked for you. She said you didn't look at her like she was broken. Corliss swallowed hard. She remembered Sam. She remembered the special education teachers who spoke to her brilliant, funny teenage brother like he was a toddler. She remembered the rage it sparked in her chest. Look at the number, Drayden said softly. Corliss dropped her gaze to the paper. She didn't mean to, but human curiosity was a terrible thing. She read the number at the bottom of the single page. Her heart stuttered. It was enough to move out of her roach-infested apartment. It was enough to pay off the crushing medical debt her father had left behind. It was enough to actually start living instead of just surviving. "This is ridiculous," she whispered. "This is hush money." "It's whatever you want to call it," Drayden said, standing up. He buttoned his coat. 3 days a week. You set the schedule. You answer to no one but Corinne. And me. He walked toward the door, his heavy boots echoing in the empty restaurant. He stopped with his hand on the brass handle and looked back over his shoulder. "I know you're not afraid of me, Corliss," Drayden said. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange in his mouth, too intimate, too heavy. "But you should know I don't take no for an answer when it comes to my family." He unlocked the door and stepped out into the gray Chicago morning, leaving the contract sitting on the table like a loaded gun. Corliss stared at the paper. She wrapped her hands around her cold coffee cup, trying to stop the trembling in her fingers. She was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the wind was pushing hard at her back. The Harris estate sat behind a 10-foot wrought iron gate on a stretch of the Gold Coast where the houses looked less like homes and more like embassies. Corliss stepped out of the ride-share, her worn canvas sneakers crunching against the impeccably swept driveway. She felt the weight of the security cameras tracking her every movement. 2 men in dark suits stood by the front doors. They didn't speak as she approached, only stepping aside to let her pass. The interior of the house was stunning, and completely dead. The floors were polished marble that echoed with every step. The walls were lined with dark, imposing artwork and antique mirrors that reflected the empty, cavernous hallways. It smelled of lemon polish and expensive, stale air. It was a museum designed for ghosts. A housekeeper in a stiff uniform led Corliss up a sweeping staircase and down a long corridor, finally pushing open a set of heavy mahogany doors. The room beyond was a sunroom wrapped in glass and overflowing with orchids and ferns. The air here was warm, smelling of damp earth and blooming jasmine. In the center of the greenery, sitting in a plush armchair with a book in her lap, was Corinne. She looked up. The moment she saw Corliss, the polite, hollow expression she wore vanished. Her face lit up with a blinding, genuine joy. She tossed the book onto a side table and stood, her hands already moving. "You came," Corinne signed, her fingers trembling slightly with excitement. "I told him you would come." Corliss dropped her canvas bag by the door. She let out a long breath, the tension of the house melting away in the warmth of the older woman's smile. She brought her hands up. "I came for the money," Corliss signed back, keeping her face perfectly deadpan. Corinne blinked, surprised by the bluntness. Then a sharp, delighted laugh burst from her throat. She pointed at Corliss, her eyes crinkling. "Good. At least you are honest. Everyone else here lies to me." That was the beginning. The transition wasn't smooth. The staff treated Corliss with a mixture of suspicion and deferential fear, unsure where the companion fit into the rigid hierarchy of a crime family's payroll. Corliss ignored them. She treated the job with the same blue-collar grit she applied to waitressing. She showed up on time. She did the work. She refused to be intimidated by the men with guns pacing the perimeter. Her real work, she quickly realized, had nothing to do with translation. It had to do with reclamation. Corinne had been stripped of her autonomy. The housekeeper ordered her meals. The guards dictated when she could walk in the gardens. Drayden dictated her schedule. Corinne existed in a state of perpetual silent waiting. Corliss stopped it on day 2. When the housekeeper brought a tray of poached salmon and steamed vegetables for lunch, setting it down with a brisk nod, Corliss intercepted her. "Mrs. Harris doesn't want salmon today," Corliss said quietly. The housekeeper frowned. "Mr. Harris requested a heart-healthy diet for his mother." "Mr. Harris isn't eating it," Corliss replied, turning to Corinne. She signed, "What do you actually want?" Corinne looked at the housekeeper, then at Corliss. A mischievous glint appeared in her blue eyes. "A cheeseburger, with the thick fries. And a Coke." Corliss turned back to the housekeeper. She wants a cheeseburger, heavy on the fries, full sugar Coke. The housekeeper looked scandalized. I can't authorize that. Then I will. A voice rumbled from the doorway. Corliss didn't jump. She just turned her head. Drayden was leaning against the doorframe, his suit jacket slung over one shoulder, his tie loose. He looked like he hadn't slept since she last saw him at the restaurant. His eyes were heavy, but they were locked entirely on Corliss. He pushed off the doorframe and walked into the sunroom. Get my mother a burger, Maria. The housekeeper nodded sharply and practically fled the room. Drayden stood by the glass looking out over the manicured lawns. He didn't look at Corinne. He didn't look at Corliss. He just stared at the grey waters of Lake Michigan in the distance. He carries the whole world on his back. Corinne signed to Corliss, watching her son with a heartbreaking mixture of pride and profound sorrow. He thinks I don't see it because I can't hear the guns. Corliss watched Drayden's rigid shoulders. She walked over to him, stopping a few feet away, close enough to smell the faint, sharp scent of gunpowder and expensive cologne clinging to his shirt. Talk to her, Corliss said softly. Drayden didn't turn. I am. I got her the lunch she wanted. That's logistics. Corliss snapped, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. That's not talking. Look at her, Drayden. She's right there. She doesn't need a boss. She needs her son. Drayden's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck jumped. For a terrifying second, Corliss thought he might backhand her. She had crossed a line. You don't give orders to the head of the Harris family in his own house. Slowly, Drayden turned his head. His dark eyes met hers. There was a dangerous, volatile energy vibrating under his skin. You don't know what I'd do out there to keep this house quiet, he whispered. I don't care. Corliss fired back, unflinching. When you walk through those doors, you leave it outside. She didn't ask for this cage. The least you can do is sit in it with her. Drayden stared at her. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Then the fight drained out of him. He let out a ragged breath and turned away from the window. He walked over to the armchair opposite his mother and heavily sat down. Corinne looked at him surprised. Drayden looked at Corliss, gesturing vaguely with his hand. Tell her the shipment came in. The legal one. The olive oil. Corliss softened. She raised her hands and translated the words, watching Corinne's face light up at the simple act of being included in her son's day. 2 weeks bled into 3. The brutal Chicago winter finally broke, giving way to a muddy, violent spring. Corliss's routine became an anchor in her otherwise chaotic life. Her bank account was flush. The medical debt was paid off. She had quit the restaurant. But instead of feeling free, she felt a strange, tightening gravity pulling her deeper into the Harris estate. She was sitting on the floor of the library one late afternoon, teaching Corinne how to sign modern slang. Corinne was laughing, her hands clumsily forming the signs, when the heavy oak doors slammed open. The laughter died instantly. Drayden stumbled into the room. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was torn at the shoulder, and a dark, spreading stain of crimson soaked the fabric over his ribs. His lip was split, and blood dripped steadily from a gash above his eyebrow, catching in his dark eyelashes. Arthur was right behind him, barking orders into a cell phone, his own face bruised and streaked with soot. Get the doctor. Now. Front gate. Arthur yelled, shutting the phone. He looked at Drayden, who was leaning heavily against a mahogany bookshelf, leaving a smear of red on the wood. Dom, you need to sit down. I'm fine. Drayden ground out. His voice was a wet rasp. Corinne scrambled up from her chair. She let out a sharp, breathless sound, a jagged noise of pure maternal terror. She rushed toward Drayden, her hands reaching out to touch his ruined shirt. Drayden instinctively flinched away, batting her hands back. Don't. Ma, don't touch it. It's fine. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the floor, trying to stay upright. Corinne froze. She was shut out again. The panic in her eyes was agonizing. She didn't know if he was dying. She didn't know what had happened. She looked frantically at Arthur, but the lieutenant was already pacing the room, checking the windows. She looked at Corliss. Corliss didn't hesitate. She crossed the room in 3 strides, ignoring the blood dripping onto the priceless Persian rug. She stepped directly between Drayden and the bookshelf, forcing him to look up. "Look at her," Corliss commanded. "Get her out of here." Drayden gasped, his hand pressing hard against his ribs. "Arthur, get them out." "No," Corliss said, her voice cracking like a whip. She grabbed Drayden's chin with her fingers. His skin was clammy cold with shock. "Look at your mother, Drayden, right now." Drayden blinked, the haze of pain parting just enough for him to focus on Corliss's fierce expression. Reluctantly, he shifted his gaze over Corliss's shoulder to Corinne, who was trembling violently. Corliss brought her hands up directly in Drayden's line of sight, forcing him to watch the translation. "He is hurt," Corliss signed to Corinne, her movements sharp and deliberate. "But he is standing. He is breathing. He is going to be okay." Corinne sobbed, her hands covering her mouth. She nodded frantically. "Tell her it was just a car accident." Drayden mumbled, his eyes sliding shut. "Tell her I hit the steering wheel." "I don't lie to her," Corliss said instantly. She looked at Corinne. "It wasn't an accident. But it's over now. The doctor is coming." Drayden's eyes snapped open. He glared at Corliss. "I told you to tell her. She's deaf, Drayden. She's not stupid." Corliss yelled, the raw emotion finally boiling over. "She smells the copper. She sees the guns. Stop treating her like a child. She can handle the truth. She can't handle you shutting her out." The library went dead silent, save for the ragged sound of Drayden's breathing. Arthur stopped pacing, staring at Corliss in absolute shock. Nobody yelled at Drayden Harris, especially not while he was bleeding. Drayden stared at Corliss. The anger in his eyes slowly fractured, revealing the deep, exhausting terror underneath. He looked past her to his mother. Corinne stepped forward. She didn't reach for his wound this time. She reached for his face. She gently cupped his uninjured cheek, her thumb wiping away a streak of blood near his eye. She looked at him, her blue eyes fierce and clear. "I survived your father." Corinne signed slowly, her hands perfectly steady. Corliss quietly translated the words aloud for Drayden, her voice softening. "I will survive you, but do not lie to me." Drayden swallowed hard. He leaned his face into his mother's palm just for a second. A single heavy concession. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, Ma." The heavy doors opened again, and a man with a black medical bag hurried in, flanked by 2 guards. "Get him on the sofa," the doctor ordered, pulling on gloves. Arthur and a guard moved in, taking Drayden's arms and guiding him away. As they lowered him onto the leather couch, Drayden's eyes tracked back to Corliss. She was standing next to Corinne, her arm wrapped protectively around the older woman's shoulders. She looked out of place in the opulent, blood-stained room. She looked tired. She looked defiant. And in that moment, staring through the haze of pain and adrenaline, Drayden realized something terrifying. He didn't just want her here for his mother anymore. He needed her here for himself. The bullet had cracked a rib torn through muscle and missed Drayden's right lung by a fraction of an inch. For 4 days, the Harris estate operated under lockdown. Black SUVs idled by the front gates. Men with heavy coats and hard eyes patrolled the perimeter. Inside the house felt like a pressurized cabin miles above the earth, waiting for a window to blow. Corliss didn't stop coming. Arthur tried to turn her away at the door on the second morning, citing security protocols. Corliss had simply stared at the scarred lieutenant, dropped her canvas bag on the marble floor, and told him she was on the payroll to see Corinne, not to guard the driveway. Arthur, perhaps remembering the way she had commanded the room while his boss bled on the Persian rug, stepped aside. She spent her hours with Corinne in the sunroom. They didn't talk about the blood. They didn't talk about the men outside. They talked about gardening. They talked about the awful soap operas Corinne watched with the subtitles on. They built a quiet, impenetrable fortress of normalcy in the middle of a war zone. On the 5th day, the heavy mahogany doors of the sunroom clicked open. Drayden stood in the threshold. He looked terrible. His skin was pale, pulling taut across the sharp angles of his face. He wore sweatpants and a dark t-shirt that hung loose over the bulky bandages wrapping his torso. He was leaning heavily on a cane, his knuckles white around the brass handle. Corinne dropped her knitting. She stood up, her hands flying to her mouth, tears instantly brimming in her eyes. Drayden offered her a weak, exhausted smile. He let go of the cane with one hand and clumsily, stiffly brought his fingers to his chin, moving them down and outward. Good. Then he pointed to himself. Then to her. I am good. Corinne let out a choked sob. She rushed forward, stopping just short of him, terrified to bump his ribs. She hovered her hands over his chest, her eyes frantically scanning his face. Corliss sat frozen in her chair. She watched the Mafia boss, a man who ordered executions over cold pasta, meticulously form the signs. They were rigid, they were awkward, but they were right. Corinne looked back at Corliss, her face radiating absolute shock and pure joy. He learned she signed her hands shaking. He learned for me. I see that Corliss signed back, keeping her face perfectly neutral, though a tight knot in her chest suddenly unraveled. Drayden limped into the room and sank into the armchair opposite his mother. He looked at Corliss. The dark, dead eyes that had terrified her in the restaurant were gone. In their place was something raw, heavy, and deeply unsettled. I watched the videos you left on the desk, Drayden said. His voice was a gravelly rasp. The beginner ones. Your syntax is terrible, Corliss said flatly. You signed good I am good instead of I am fine. But you didn't accidentally tell her you were a potato, so it's a start. A short, painful laugh punched out of Drayden's chest. He instantly grimaced, wrapping an arm around his ribs. Don't make me laugh. It feels like I'm swallowing glass. Then don't be funny, Corliss replied. Corinne sat on the edge of the sofa watching the exchange. She couldn't hear the banter, but she could read the energy in the room. The air between her son and the waitress was thick, practically humming like a live wire. She looked at Drayden, noting the way his eyes tracked Corliss's every movement. She looked at Corliss, seeing the way the younger woman sat slightly forward, anchored to Drayden's presence. Corinne smiled quietly to herself and picked up her knitting. An hour later, Corinne fell asleep on the sofa, exhausted by the adrenaline crash of seeing her son upright. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan, casting long, bruised shadows across the glass walls of the room. Drayden stared out at the water. Arthur caught the crew that hit us. They were moving out of a warehouse in the south side. I don't need to know that, Corliss said. She was organizing a stack of flashcards on the coffee table. I'm just telling you. I don't want to know the logistics of your violence, Drayden, Corliss said, looking up. Her voice was quiet but firm. I told you that. I'm a civilian. Drayden turned his head slowly. The shadows caught the hollows of his cheeks. You're not a civilian anymore, Corliss. You haven't been since you stepped between Arthur's gun and that idiot waiter. I'm an employee. You're a target. Drayden corrected his tone, turning dark. He leaned forward, ignoring the obvious pain it caused him. They know about you. The other families. They have spotters watching this house. They know there's a girl who comes 3 days a week and leaves 4 hours later. They know my mother loves you. Corliss stopped shuffling the cards. Her hands went perfectly still. A cold spike of adrenaline shot down her spine. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you, Drayden said softly. He reached into the pocket of his sweatpants and pulled out a thick white envelope. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud next to the flashcards. "There's 50,000 in cash in there, and a plane ticket to Seattle. Open-ended." Corliss stared at the envelope. "What is this?" "An out," Drayden said. "Take it. Leave the city. Don't come back. The contract is void." Corliss looked from the envelope to Drayden's face. He was completely serious. The walls were back up. The ruthless, sterile corporate raider had returned, trying to manage a liability. "And Corinne?" Corliss asked. "She'll survive. She always does." Drayden looked away. "I'll hire someone else. I'll make them learn the language." Corliss picked up the envelope. It was heavy. It was a new life. It was safety. She thought about her cramped apartment, the broken radiator, the constant grinding fear of poverty that had chased her since she was a teenager. She could take it. She could run. She stood up. She walked over to Drayden's chair. He didn't look up, bracing himself for the sound of her footsteps walking towards the door. Instead, she dropped the envelope into his lap. Drayden's head snapped up. "I told you," Corliss said, her voice entirely devoid of fear. "I don't take hush money, and I don't run from bullies." "Corliss, you don't understand what these people will do." "I don't care," she interrupted, leaning down. She planted her hands on the arms of his chair, bringing her face inches from his. She smelled of cheap vanilla soap and sheer, unadulterated defiance. "I survived a father who drank away our mortgage. I survived a brother dying in a hospital bed while the doctors ignored him. I survive. That's what I do." Drayden stared at her, his breath hitching in his throat. "You don't get to buy your way out of this," Corliss whispered fiercely. "You don't get to push me away because you're scared. You're going to learn the rest of the alphabet. You're going to talk to your mother, and you're going to deal with me." The silence that followed was absolute. Drayden looked at the fierce, beautiful girl trapping him in his own chair. He had spent his entire life commanding respect through fear. He broke men. He broke organizations. But he couldn't break her. She was made of something harder than bone. Slowly, painfully, Drayden raised his hand. He didn't push her away. He reached up and wrapped his long fingers around the back of her neck, his thumb resting against the erratic pulse jumping in her throat. Corliss didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her eyes burning with a desperate, cynical fire. "I'm a dead man, Corliss," Drayden whispered, his voice cracking. The admission fell out of him like blood from a wound. "I'm drowning. Every day I wake up, and I wait for the bullet that finishes the job." "Then stop waiting," Corliss said, her voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "Fight back. I am—" He breathed his grip on her neck, tightening just enough to pull her a fraction of an inch closer. "But if they take you, if they touch you to get to me—" "They won't," she said firmly, "because you won't let them." It wasn't a question. It was a command. It was a profound, terrifying display of trust from a woman who didn't trust anyone. Drayden closed his eyes. The fight drained out of him, leaving only the bone-deep exhaustion he had carried for months. He pulled her down. Corliss didn't resist. She let her knees bend, dropping onto the edge of the cushion beside his hip, careful of his bandaged ribs. Drayden buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her vanilla soap. He wrapped his free arm around her waist, anchoring her against him, like a man clinging to a piece of driftwood in a hurricane. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It was desperate. It was a collision of two people who had spent their entire lives fighting entirely different wars, finally realizing they were standing in the same trench. Corliss rested her chin on the top of his head. Her hands, calloused from years of hauling heavy plates and scrubbing industrial counters, gently stroked the dark hair at the nape of his neck. From the sofa, Corinne stirred. She blinked the sleep clearing from her eyes. She looked across the room. She saw her son, the ruthless, terrifying boss of the Chicago syndicate, practically curled into the lap of the quiet waitress. She saw the tension completely drained from his shoulders. She saw Corliss holding him, her eyes fierce and protective, watching the door. Corinne didn't make a sound. She didn't tap the table. She just watched them, a profound sense of peace settling over her chest. Eventually, Drayden pulled back. He looked at Corliss, his dark eyes clear for the first time since she had met him. He reached up and gently traced the line of her jaw. "You're not a waitress anymore," Drayden said softly. "I know," Corliss replied. "You're not just an employee." "I know." Drayden looked over Corliss's shoulder. He saw his mother watching them. Corinne offered him a small, knowing smile. She raised her hands. Her movements were slow, graceful, and entirely silent. Family Corinne signed. Drayden stared at his mother's hands. He swallowed the thick knot forming in his throat. He looked back at Corliss, who had turned to read the sign. Corliss looked back at him. The cynicism in her eyes had fractured, letting in a sliver of terrifying, beautiful hope. Drayden raised his hands. His fingers were stiff, his movements clumsy and lacking the fluid grace of his mother or the crisp efficiency of Corliss. But he formed the signs perfectly. Yes, Drayden signed, his eyes locked on Corliss's. Family. The war outside the iron gates would rage on. The shipments would stall, the feds would circle, and the violence would continue to bleed into the streets of Chicago. Drayden Harris was still a dangerous man in a dangerous world. But as he sat in the quiet sunroom, holding the girl who refused to run, surrounded by a silence that no longer felt like a cage, Drayden knew one thing for certain. He was finally ready to fight for it. Did Corliss make the right choice, staying in a world of violence, or did she just seal her own fate? Drop a comment below with your thoughts if you loved this deep dive into the silent, intense world of the Harris family. Hit that like button, share it with your friends who love grounded, gritty romance, and don't forget to subscribe for more intense, slow-burn stories that skip the cliches and get straight to the heart. Turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter.